often think about big things starting in places with lots of people, with plenty of opportunities for creative collaboration and chance meetings that spark relationships and ideas across distances. Think Renaissance Florence, Baroque era Vienna, Silicon Valley from the 1980s on. Well, today we're going to talk about the enormously influential rise of the modern American conservative movement, which has a very different origin story. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Krys Boyd. My guest is a political historian, and in his new book, he makes a strong case that the way the conservative movement works in this country today, what it values, how it thinks, who it fears and reveres, all that has roots in the rugged, wide-open spaces and towns and small cities of the Plains, specifically and especially West Texas. It sounds preposterous, given that the leader of the movement today is a New York City guy through and through. But once you hear Jeff Roche's argument, the pieces of that puzzle come together in a way that's hard to unsee. Roche is a professor of American history at the College of Wooster and author of The Conservative Frontier, Texas and the Origins of the New Right. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you.
For people outside the state of Texas, can you give us a sense of the geographic area that we're talking about? Because this is a land area that is more than just the part of the state that sits to the left of the straight line between Texas and New Mexico.
Sure. I guess the best way to understand it is that it's the southernmost section of the Great Plains. From an environmental standpoint, an ecological standpoint, a geographic standpoint, it has much more in common with Western Kansas or even Alberta, Canada, than it does with sort of the eastern part of the state. Doesn't rain very much. There's no rivers. There's very few trees. It's a very different kind of a landscape that forced a new kind of culture to emerge on it.
And it does include El Paso geographically, but that is not part of this West Texas story that we're telling today.
No, a lot of people consider the little section of Texas that sits under New Mexico. That's in some definitions of West Texas. Others, including mine, don't include the Trans-Pecos in our definition. For me, it's a different kind of ecology. It's a different kind of demography. It has a different history.
So what are some of the data points that suggest West Texas is the most reliably conservative place in the entire country and has been for a very long time?
That was true up until a couple of years ago, actually. But yeah, so for example, through most of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Texas 13th congressional district, which sits at the very, very top of the Texas Panhandle, was the most reliably Republican congressional district in the country. It was what they measured it plus 33, which means on average 83% of the people in that congressional district vote Republican. So,
which I would imagine is a Republican's dream if they're strategizing. This is a place where they don't even have to work very hard to win elections.
Not at all. And then just below it, the 11th and the 19th run like a strong second or third. So it really stretches that whole boundary. And yes, it is. Democrats really don't even bother to run in a lot of these elections. I've seen election results, local stuff, where the second place candidate is a libertarian candidate.
When you note that West Texas has a shorter political history than many other geographic regions in the U.S., what do you mean by that?
This is one of the things that drew me to the project. White settlement didn't start there until 1876. So unlike a lot of other Western places and places in the rest of the country, its basic history in terms of its politics and its economy, modern politics, is just 150 years old. So it doesn't have a lot of the long-standing ties that other parts of the country have. So they really did create kind of their own regional identity that in many ways is kind of tied up in their politics.
Why is it consequential that compared with the Deep South, there is really no history? I mean, slavery was legal in that part of Texas, but it really just wasn't an issue for West Texas.
The only slavery that was practiced in that part of Texas was by the Comanche and Apache nations. There were literally that part of the world was controlled primarily by the Comanche right up until 1875. people just didn't go there. And if you did, you were there to either trade with the Comanche or to get through as quickly and as safely as you possibly could.
How were the indigenous peoples who had lived in that region for a long time removed?
Yeah, so the Comanche especially were a incredibly powerful, one great brilliant historians called it, it's an empire. And it's one of the most that's what I'm looking for, unknown sort of empires. But in terms of economically, militarily, socially, the Comanche dominated from Santa Fe to San Antonio for over 100 years. So and places like Texas, governments like the United States had to deal with the Comanche almost on equal footing. So when after the Civil War, once the United States government began to concentrate on clearing the plains of tribes like the Comanche, they basically had to use almost a counterinsurgents harassment campaign. There was just no way you could take the Comanche on head first. So they destroyed their markets. So they went after the places where the Comanche traded. The Comanche were a very, very wealthy empire. So they went after their trading partners, destroyed their markets, and then began harassing them across the plains until they were forced, really, to move onto the Fort Sill Reservation. There's just no place left that they wouldn't be bothered constantly. And that went on from... Go ahead.
The federal government was involved in removal of Native peoples from West Texas, but not so much in directing the area's political or economic evolution. Yeah. Why is that consequential in the story we're telling today?
I think it's essential to understand the way that Texas land law works, and this is perhaps one of the most boring subjects in the world, unless you're really into it like I am. So I'll try to make this as interesting as I can. Texas, when it joined the Union, did so with the understanding that it would control its public lands. So unlike the rest of the West that were carved out into territories and then the federal government could give people land, Texas controlled it all. And they did give away land. They did give away quite a bit of land. But the majority of the land they gave, especially in West Texas, was to railroads. And ranches bought up millions of acres on the cheap. They bought up land using sort of scrip and stuff. So West Texas lands went into private ownership really early. And it went into private ownership by companies, land companies, railroad companies that controlled hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres. The XIT Ranch, to give the most obvious and largest example, was awarded 3 million acres by the Texas government in exchange for building the Capitol building in Austin.
It was not a foregone conclusion that Texas would be one big state. There was talk at some point of West Texas being its own thing. Yeah,
this is one of those fun factoids about Texas. That when the other thing it did when it joined the Union was it joined with an understanding that if it wanted to, and everyone assumed they were going to, I should add this, would carve into as many as 5 states, which was the same amount of states that were carved out of the Northwest Ordinance. But in 1845, when this goes into effect, Texas is really just kind of Austin and east and south, right? So the concept of the 5 states was in the distant future. And they never got around to it, but it's still there. And it's one of those things that Texans like to talk about. They could become 5 states, and they're the only state that's legally allowed to do this.
We would lose some swagger, though, because there wouldn't be the size thing.
And it would be shaped differently. I mean, the shape of Texas is iconic.
Why did it happen that West Texas developed so rapidly as an agricultural region once settlers of European descent started moving in?
There's a couple of reasons for it. One is it rained pretty consistently. There were a few micro droughts for the first couple of decades of the 20th century. So there was above average rainfall, but mostly it was technology. The tractor and certain implements that you could use behind a tractor made this part of the world, it made it possible to farm at scale. So you could do, and then there were new farming products, in particular a kind of winter wheat that's pretty easy to plant and harvest, and it's a particular kind of cotton that you can pick with a machine. And once that took over, this is one of the fastest growing places because people were doing very well. I mean, it was, in addition to being the fastest growing for the first couple of decades of the 20th century, these were middle class farmers. These weren't poor, sharecroppers or people trying to make a living on a 160 acre patch in western Kansas. These were people who were thriving.
So that was in some ways an accident of history, this, literally right place at the right time as people started moving in so rapidly. As you say, they were making money initially.
Mm-hmm.
What did those settlers tend to have in common with one another demographically, besides the fact that they were overwhelmingly white?
Overwhelmingly white, 98%, and most were native born. Almost all of them were Christian. Baptist, Methodist, Church of Christ were the big three there. And they all, again, I'm generalizing here, but all of those folks were coming there to practice this new form of commercial family agriculture. So the place was sold as a region where you could farm differently, and farms weren't sold necessarily as homesteads, but as business opportunities. So these were people who were entrepreneurially minded, that were business focused, and it wasn't just the farmers, but it was also the lawyers and the doctors and the newspaper editors and the merchants who filled in all of these small towns that are designed to service that family commercial agricultural economy.
Where were the Texans of Latino descent? Why were they not part of this rapid resettling of this part of the state?
In most, I don't want to say most because but in a large number of the land companies that were selling land did not sell land to Latinos, nor did it sell land to African Americans, Asian Americans. They made it pretty clear that this was a place that land was only going to be sold to white people. And it was right front and center in the advertising.
So this rapid settlement happens with white Christians, after which there's not a whole lot of movement in, right? Not a lot of newcomers. You say that this makes West Texas function in some ways, cities function more like small towns. Yeah. Explain that.
So the thing to understand about this part of the world is this growth continues right up until 1930, 1931. And then once the drought and the Dust Bowl began, population declines in a lot of these places. So these towns and the larger cities, their main purpose in most of these places is to get the products that are produced in the rural areas around it to market. And so when most of these towns since 1930 are populated by people from West Texas, many of them might have grown up on a farm and a ranch and literally moved to town. A lot of the cities are also populated now by people who had lived in the small towns across the area, most of which are shrinking in population. Every decade, most of these counties are shrinking in population. So even though you have a place like Lubbock, well over 100,000 people, of those 100,000, the vast majority are from within 100 miles of Lubbock. So the culture doesn't really change.
Jeff, you talk about the culture of West Texas being driven by cowboy conservatism. What is cowboy conservatism?
So I guess the easiest way to think about it is it's a kind of conservative ideology. Like it's specific to the middle third of the United States, and the part of the United States that was the heart of the cattle kingdom, which the first people to settle this area to sort of prove it could work within the modern American economy were ranchers. And they built out an entire economy, and they built out an entire identity and business model that worked. And it worked because it didn't need the state to operate. And and the whole sort of ideology that emerges from that is a place that individualism and individual freedom is the absolute most essential part of any kind of a society. So, and accompanying this, which I think is a great cultural power, as this cattle kingdom is growing and becoming an important part of the American economy, and the settlement of into these old ranches, the mythic Western, and the Western films and Western novels elevate the cowboy and the rancher to this status of being the uber American. The American identity became tied up into sort of being a cowboy. And so it gives this ideology a great deal of power, and individual freedom becomes essential to the conservative brand very early on, especially once the state starts getting more powerful under the New Deal. There's a lot of chafing, and that's where you can sort of identify cowboy conservatism beginning to come to the fore of Texas politics.
We should know that there is mythology wrapped up in any cultural identity anybody could have anywhere in the world. Is there something that makes this sort of cowboy Western frontier mythology powerful in a different way?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, maybe you can talk about Frederick Jackson Turner
Oh,
and sort of the way the whole country started looking at the West in a romantic, nostalgic way that may not have fully accurately reflected reality for people.
sure. Happy to. So there's a very, very, very famous historical essay called "The Significance of the Frontier in American History," delivered by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. And the gist of the argument is that what makes Americans Americans, what makes American democracy work, what makes the country at that point, the envy of the world as it sort of emerged from the Civil War and was thriving during the Industrial Revolution of the late and becoming this world power. Everyone was wondering how it was that Americans had pulled this off. And Turner argues it was the successive settlement of frontiers. And with every settlement, Americans became a little bit more American because they had to reinvent democracy. They had to they had to rebuild a society. They had to build community. And over generations of this, the American character was born. And it has such power by the early 20th century. It is the national narrative that is taught in American schools for decades and decades and decades.
So like Yankee kids are learning this up in the Northeast, and they're learning this in the Pacific Northwest everywhere.
Everywhere. This becomes the national narrative. And it's a way, in some ways, there's been lots of scholarship on this, that it offers an alternative narrative history that is more triumphant than a story of conflict between the North and the South. And it becomes something that both people from the North and people from the South can look to the West and say, "Oh, yeah, that's part of us. That's part of our story as well." And they fit into that frontier model because at one point Massachusetts was a frontier, and Georgia was a frontier. So something in every part of the country, and in West Texas, it takes on incredible power because that's, all apologies to Alaska, the last frontier. This was the last place in America, last large space in America that experienced white settlement. It's the last place that railroads began to come into. And when you're that, and this narrative emerges, you're literally the protagonist in the last chapter of the American story.
So was Turner right or wrong in his hypothesis about the American character, or just over-interpreted and sort of applied to too many aspects of American life?
Yes. The historians argue about this all the time, and this is, and I'm a Western historian, so I've been involved in these arguments for a long time. And my response is, it doesn't really matter whether or not he was right. What matters is people thought he was right, and they built out a culture and an educational system and regional identity and in some ways a national identity based on that idea. And once that takes over, whether or not the myth has any merit is secondary to the fact that suddenly it's taken on a role in the development of something even larger.
Can you explain this term agricultural fundamentalism?
Sure. Agricultural fundamentalism is an idea that the health of the American state and the health of the American economy and the health of American democracy is founded on having a nation of farmers. That it is our agricultural communities and our small towns and our rural areas that produce. They produce the food, and they produce the wheat and the meat and the cotton and the pork. And they are the bedrock of American society, and they should have a great deal to say about the direction of the country, and that the country needs them. And this is a very, very old idea, and you see it. It's still, I think, an essential part of American identity, but especially in these places where agriculture is an essential part of the local economy and culture.
So this is obviously understandable, right? And it's understandable that people in the agricultural plain states and West Texas in particular would feel this great pride in the contributions they made. It doesn't necessarily automatically lead to significant political influence. So I wonder if you could talk about, if that first big money in West Texas came from the ranching industry, what did the scions of those ranches do with the money they inherited from their parents that started to buy them political power?
So this is one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is to, I don't want to say strip away the mythology that surrounds these ranchers, but to understand them in sort of contemporary terms. They were entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. They didn't move out to this part of the world because they had some, love of the cattle business. The cattle business was a way to make money. And almost a lot of them, once they started making that money, immediately began investing in other things. And their sons and daughters and their grandsons and granddaughters owned banks, and they almost all of them went into real estate of one sort or another. They founded towns. They bought newspapers and got involved in media. So they many of the more powerful families that function in places like Amarillo and Lubbock and Midland have a whole lot of fingers in a whole lot of different kinds of pies. And it allows them to sort of, it gives them extraordinary cultural power in addition to economic and political power.
Cultural power gives you the ability, if you're a young person inheriting money, to stay or to move out. Of course, over time, because of these technologies that you've already mentioned, fewer and fewer human bodies were needed to labor on these ranches and farms. How did that contribute to really a very conservative way of thinking in a lot of these places?
It's like we alluded to a little earlier. There's very little in-migration and a lot of out-migration. We think about it as a thought process that becomes more concentrated, because it doesn't get diluted, and it ties a lot of these folks to this land as these farms and ranches grow. And it's not uncommon for somebody to put out 10,000 acres in wheat. That's not an uncommon size. So you are wedded to this particular economy, and a lot of the decisions that you make are founded upon protecting this huge asset that you have and protecting this kind of an economy, which, again, because of these ancient geologic and ecological features, it still doesn't rain a lot. You are still very much subject to some of the most extreme weather that we have in the country. You're exposed as a commercial family farmer to a lot of different dangers.
How does a cowboy conservative do patriotism? What does that look like?
This begins. It starts uh, really during the Cold War in profound ways. The United States had never really had to kind of define itself. It hadn't really become a nation that, functioned beyond regions until the 20th century. So Americans began, West Texans especially, began to identify themselves as Americanists, and they began to define Americanism as being the opposite of communism. And central to Americanism is this individualism that I'm discussing. And pretty soon, any kind of a threat to that individualism becomes suspect. So you have a lot of folks in West Texas who began to look askance at anything different that doesn't look like what your idea of what America should look like.
So individualism makes perfect sense, but it wasn't a sort of every person for themselves
No.
individualism. People help me understand how people felt an obligation to their communities, but really pushed up against the idea that government should direct how neighbor helped neighbor.
Yeah, so this is one of the fascinating things, again, about West Texas, and of course the I think the Great Plains in general, that accompanying that desire for individual freedom and the protection of the individual comes a very healthy and buffering sense of an obligation to community. And along with a personal code that people should follow that protects a place from chaotic, from chaos and anarchy. And these include things like modesty, humility, faith, and all of which tend to restrain, the rampant individualism, and they work in tandem. If anybody's been to West Texas, will tell you these are some of the friendliest, most outgoing, protective of their neighbors, people anywhere.
And shirt off their back people. Yeah.
Yep, and that's part of it. That's as much a part of it as the demand that the government protect the individual.
This might surprise people. So you have this sort of conservative culture, this sense of conformity that's really important, coupled with, in West Texas in particular, a real openness to women's suffrage. So talk about the role of women in these communities and why people were open to the idea that it would be all right for women to vote.
There's a couple of parts to this that I think are interesting. Is one, during settlement, because these were commercial family farms, the gender balance in West Texas was 1-to-1. And for a frontier area, that's very, very odd. Most frontiers, like a mining frontier, it'll be 10-to-1 or even 20-to-1. This gender balance is part of it. The second has to do with the Turner thesis, as we were talking about earlier. The Turner thesis is based on concept of progress, that Americans would become more democratic, and the suffrage will expand. It's beyond just the common man. And in West Texas, seeing themselves as the heirs to this long-standing trajectory of literal progress, see women's suffrage as the next logical step in expanding the democracy. And again, this place is protective of individuals, and those include women. And so,
go ahead. Will you talk about Phoebe Warner and what's called the municipal housekeeping argument?
Yeah, so one of the arguments that suffrage leaders had been making for several decades during the suffrage movement was that women needed to be involved in politics because politics was a dirty business and it lacked morality, and women would bring that to the practice of politics, which was a direct response to the argument that women shouldn't be in American politics because it was dirty and it would sully them. And the municipal housekeeping argument is like, yes, that's why you need us. We're going to bring order to the chaos.
But it still relied on this very prescriptive idea of the differences between women and men fundamentally.
Yes, and this is one of the great arguments of the suffrage movement was that you can't have a moral nation unless you allow morality into this politics, but not challenging basic ideas of gender, maintaining this separate sphere that and there was a we we treasure our roles as mothers, and we treasure our roles as the head of a household, head of a household economy. That's not what we're challenging. We just want to bring more of that into the public sphere, and it was very, very effective.
Jeff, this history gets so interesting as we move into the first half of the 20th century. How did it happen that many people in West Texas got so solidly behind Herbert Hoover, who is not necessarily a heroic figure, even on the right today?
It's so always tragic what happened to poor Herbert Hoover, because before 1929 he was, along with people like Will Rogers, one of the most respected Americans anywhere. He had been. Will Rogers actually joked that when people get sick, they call a doctor. When countries get sick, they call Herbert Hoover. He was literally seen as a national hero. And in some ways, he had so much in common with the people of West Texas. He grew up on a frontier. He grew up on a frontier that was in the process of moving from one agricultural means of production to another. He was actually involved in a company that sold commercial family agricultural real estate. And he's the embodiment in the ways of what they'd been doing. And in 1922, he sums up his philosophy in a book called American Conservatism, or I'm sorry, American Individualism. And it reads exactly as if it had been written by, say, the Amarillo Chamber of Commerce. I mean, it's a celebration of all of the things that people from West Texas had been building their politics on for the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And when he announces the Republican Party in Texas, almost like after a heavy rain out there, you'll suddenly hear the frogs emerge from underground. He runs, and suddenly a Republican Party that had been dormant in a lot of ways springs to life. And because of how excited people were to vote for this guy.
Yeah, we should note that there had been a lot of Democrats in Texas. I mean, the way the Democratic Party looks today is very different culturally from what it may have looked like at the time. There was room to sort of remake what the Republican Party stood for in Texas.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important for listeners to understand that until the 1970s, Texas was a solidly Democratic state. There, and one of the stories of the last third of the book is how the Republican Party was able to come to prominence, or come into existence, I guess, first, and then into prominence. So, that Democratic Party was the dominant political force in the state. But Hoover was really popular, and the Democratic candidate that year was a Catholic from New York who was anti-prohibition. So there was a lot of anti-Al Smith sentiment in that 1928 election that also drove a lot of people that had it been another, candidate that was not from New York, not part of Tammany. No, it might have been a different story, but it was. So there were a lot of people who stayed home, and there were a lot of people who switched over and voted for Herbert Hoover. Many of them for the first time voting for a Republican ever, that they couldn't even have imagined it 2 years before the election.
Why did the arrival of a climate event like the Dust Bowl have such a profound effect on how West Texans saw themselves in contrast to the rest of the country, and in opposition to the next president who would come along, and that was FDR?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that this everything for 30 or 40 years, again, there would be like small droughts or whatever, it had just been this constant story of progress and growth And this was a place that had cracked the code. They'd figured out how to live in this place and were thriving, and their cities were growing, and everything was going just fantastic. And then it stopped raining, and nothing could solve the riddle. And people moved down, and stores closed, and some of these counties experienced 25% population loss. And imagine if you're there and suddenly 25% of the population is just gone. Churches began to close. It was just a very, very traumatic event for that part of the world, and really for most of the Great Plains. And many of these counties, their population peaked in 1930. Even 2020, they don't have the same population they had 90 years ago.
So why did people bristle against New Deal efforts to try and offer relief?
Well, part of it is this individualism and kind of a built-in distrust of the state. But not necessarily turning against FDR or necessarily the New Deal. One of the rationales for taking some of this relief money and recovery money was that the federal government had been protecting industry and cities for so long at the expense of farmers that, yes, the federal government should come in and help farmers, that they are the backbone of the country. And it's this agrarian fundamentalism that we were talking about earlier. So that is a powerful way to contextualize New Deal money that's coming. The second is you starve without it. When the wheat checks, those first set of wheat checks came in, it was a monumental event. This was the first cash money a lot of these folks had seen in months and months and months. But it was always with a degree of hesitation or an understanding that it's going to be temporary. So it wasn't a full-blown embrace, but rejection just really wasn't an option. Let's say that. And there's ways of sort of framing it within a story of where farmers fit into the larger story that they should be protected by the federal government. And for some people, it's about time. So go ahead.
To this day, Texas is such a large state, and we order so many textbooks that a lot of people think about the conservatism of Texas really shaping the way people think throughout the country. I hadn't realized just how far back that tradition goes. Will you tell us about the historian J. Evetts Haley?
J. Evetts Haley is the main figure in this book. I think he's in almost every single chapter. He's absolutely essential in helping define the politics of the region and also define the history of the region. He's a very, very good historian, and he's interested in the way that history is portrayed. And in the late 1950s, he organizes a group called Texans for America. And in the early 60s, they become Texas's first textbook watchdog group. And you're right, Texas buys more textbooks than any other state in the union as a state, because Texas buys all the textbooks used in the state for all the students. Other places do it slightly differently. And textbook makers simply have to tailor their books to this huge market. And Haley and the Texans for America took advantage of this and began to appear before the committees that decide what textbooks are going to be chosen and complain about particular textbooks that are under review, or describe them as un-American, or describe them as possibly containing subversive communist content that's not noticeable to most people's naked eye. You had to be kind of trained to look for what to look for. And for a year, they raised holy heck. I don't know if I can say the other word on the radio, but yeah, they and that tradition obviously has continued in Texas right up until the present day. Both the buying of the books, but also pressure for what those textbooks should contain and how they should read.
Why was there so much anxiety in West Texas in the middle of the 20th century about the encroachment of communism, given, as we've discussed, the relative isolation and the fact that not a lot of newcomers were or are moving in?
And it's not just West Texas. It became so essential there. I think a large part because this is a fairly conformist part of the world, and um, when and we need to make everybody in America in the 1950s, with very small exceptions, was anti-communist. It's just here is where that anti-communism took on a little bit of a paranoid tint, where it was not necessarily fear of Soviet invasion or some sort of military conflict with the Soviet Union, but that communists had infiltrated the highest echelons of government and education, religion, and that West Texans, it was their responsibility to keep an eye out for evidence of that as it might exist in West Texas. So almost anything that seemed different could be viewed in that light as this might be evidence of potential subversion within our midst.
Can you remind us of who John Tower was and why he had such a strong influence on how the Republican Party would come to define itself in West Texas and Texas?
John Tower is a political scientist. He is a scholar and was working he'd gone to London School of Economics, and he had gone at SMU, and he was teaching at a school in Wichita Falls, Midwestern University. And he came under the wing of a man named Orville Bullington, who was a very powerful figure in the Texas Republican Party, such as it was, and the leader of one of the real conservative wing of the Texas Republican Party. And he's his cousin-in-law. And Bullington comes over to swing and gets involved in Republican Party politics in the 1950s. And the Republican Party is very, very small. And Tower is very smart. And he's able to articulate a kind of conservatism that is based sort of Edmund Burke and Thomas Jefferson. And it's a way of framing it as something other than just knee-jerk anti-communism. And he gets involved in the party and kind of becomes the intellectual force in the Republican Party in the late 1950s. And in 1960, the party asks him to run for Senate against Lyndon Johnson, who at the time is Senate Majority Leader and the most powerful political figure in the state of Texas, and second is a distant second. So Tower takes on the task and with relish. He's a young guy. He's full of energy. The National Republican Party is excited to have this young Turk running, so he gets a lot of support from the National Party. And Johnson that year had forced through the Texas legislature a bill that would allow him to run for Senate and the vice presidency at the same time, so that in case he and Kennedy lost, he wouldn't lose his Senate seat. So he's running for these. So he's running for these two elections. Of course, Kennedy wins. Johnson takes over the vice presidency, and suddenly there's an open Senate seat. And Tower has been running by this point, and he ran a fun campaign against Johnson. He's having a good time, and there are a lot of people who are dissatisfied with Johnson, and the Republican Party's growing. And with the help of this National Republican Party, Tower's able to start to build an infrastructure that can elect a Republican to statewide office. So they have another election that's wide open. I can't remember how many people are in this thing. There's lots and lots and lots of them in the first primary, or the first election, I should say. And Tower, I think he finishes first because all of the other votes have been scattered. And once that happens, he moves on to the runoff, and then the National Republican Party really sends in the big guns. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush's dad is lending him his plane, and Barry Goldwater is flying in, and miracle of miracles, John Tower pulls off this amazing win in the spring of 1961 and becomes the first Republican from the South in the U.S. Senate since Reconstruction. And again, he's a super smart guy. He's really into party politics, and he rises through the ranks very, very quickly. And by 64, he and a guy named Peter O'Donnell, who was his campaign manager, have created a legitimate Republican Party in Texas in light speed. And that was very, very effective.
I can't let you go without talking about Ronald Reagan, whose unsuccessful bid for the GOP nomination in 1976 comes at the end of this book. How did it happen that Ronald Reagan, a guy born in the Midwest, very much, a Hollywood sensation, some would say a real cowboy, some would say a pretend actor cowboy, how did he become the darling of West Texas conservatism, and ultimately sort of the figure by which, until recently, all conservatives were measured in this country?
Yeah, he's the George Washington on the conservative Mount Rushmore for sure. There's a couple things that people forget about Reagan, I think, and one was his role as the host of the General Electric Theater, which ran for 2 years. This incredibly popular show. It had great ratings. It followed Ed Sullivan, and it was on CBS. And CBS was the most powerful station in West Texas. So most of these cities had a CBS affiliate, and he's beaming into people's living rooms, and he's cool, and he's like this TV figure that's coming into their homes, and he's calm. And for a lot of people who had seen him in the movies, they knew him as an actor, but this was really who they thought he was. That is this role in the General Electric Theater, and it featured his family, and they lived in this amazingly cool house that GE had built for them. So he's this modern, really interesting guy. And then after the show airs, he does like Death Valley Days, but he really begins to become a political actor on the right. By the late 1950s, he's giving conservative talks. He's adopting the kind of anti-communist rhetoric and ideas that are coming out of the far right conservative wing of the Republican Party in West Texas. They absolutely adore him. He's there. He's in West Texas giving speeches 2-3 times a year. Every year. So he's there. I think it's the Texas Cattlemen's Association sent out a statement in 1962 wanting Ronald Reagan to be president. So long before he ever even entered office. And then, he gets elected governor of California and turns out to be a pretty effective governor. So now he's a proven entity. So when he runs for president in 76, Texas, they flock to him. It's the first presidential primary they'd ever had in Texas. And he just wails on Gerald Ford. He wins some counties 8-1, 9-1. And I think he won all but 3 counties across the state. So, but they'd been liking Ronald Reagan by that point for 20 years.
Jeff Roche is professor of American history at the College of Wooster and author of The Conservative Frontier, Texas and the Origins of the New Right. Jeff, thank you for making time to talk.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at our website, think.kera.org. Again, I'm Krys Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.